welcome everyone to Monday at Emmanuel, especially Bishop Wayne Miller. It's good to have you back. You're a friend of the congregation. You've been down here multiple times. And like we said in the recording, it's like you had us going with your presentation last year, and then we just didn't have enough time to finish it, and people seem to really resonate with your model of how to integrate faith, work, and economics, and what that means for the integrated life. And so we're just so pleased that you can return to Emmanuel. Wayne, usually it's easy to invite people from this lecture series from the north to come down in February to Naples to give these lectures. I don't have a hard time getting people to come. This year's a little different via Zoom, so I'm glad that you'll join.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be shoveling 12 inches of new snow this afternoon. So.
That dropped last night?
Well, it's coming this afternoon. They're saying by tomorrow morning that we could have another 12 inches. So.
And again, people have written to request this free gift, which is this wonderful magazine from Church History. By the way, the senior editor of Church History will join us next week, Chris Armstrong. But this is a special edition that's entitled "When the Church Goes to Market: How Christians Have Influenced Economic Life." It's really quite a unique magazine with various articles from church history on the impact Christians have had on both local economies and macro economies. So again, just write to Howard Ostrom or Beatrice here at Emmanuel Academies, and we give out the first 30 free. That we've got 30 free copies, and so I don't want to say they're going like hotcakes, but they are being mailed out.
Rick, that would not be Howard Ostrom anymore.
Oh, excuse me. Did I say Howard Ostrom? Well, I'm glad that's a blast from the past. Wow.
Yeah.
Sorry, Howard.
No, it's all right.
Howard's right here in the room.
I'm going to look to add Howard Ostrom to our team.
So,
All right. Maybe not.
So the way we'd like to have the conversation this morning is you've probably seen the Sunday Forum where we're engaged in a dialogue. And I'm going to try to pick up, Wayne, some of the themes right at the beginning that I think you might want to pick up on and what we'd like to discuss together as a group. But obviously, coming out of the interview, everybody's going to have their own themes and their own set of interests. And that's the whole goal of Monday to Emmanuel is the dialogue. And so just a couple items, and you can either comment or not, or wait for later when others ask the questions. But a couple things I thought were striking, Wayne. And the first was you described your present role, shoveling snow and cooking a breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As a vocational change in your life. I mean, it's a shift. And I think it's one that many of us here at Emmanuel have experienced when we move maybe from full-time employment to retirement, when we can dedicate more time to family or to other pursuits, volunteering. But you had understood that as a vocational change. Actually, oh my God, I thought that was fascinating, and we'll see if anyone picks up on those interests. But maybe you could talk just briefly to warm us up about your model. You use faith, work, and economics. You put it in this triangle, and then you associate the relationship between them with social ethics, morality, and governance. Maybe just say a word about how you find that helpful in your own thinking about living an integrated life.
Sure. So just kind of try to spell this out a little bit briefly. So as a matter of faith related to vocation, I happen to believe that everyone is called by God at any particular moment to be someone and to do something and to go somewhere. And Christian freedom is about having the freedom to follow that calling, that vocation, but it isn't the same at every point in our life, right? We have an ongoing relationship with God. So we're constantly in a conversation with God about what am I called to be, or who am I called to be, what am I called to do, and where am I called to go at this particular time in my life. And we don't follow that vocation solely as isolated individuals. We're always in some social or communal context, right? So for me, as I was developing this model, what I was looking for was something that would integrate who I am in my relationship with God as the faith component, and how that relationship with God is calling me to act in the world, which is my work, and also how is that work being called to integrate with the work of a whole community, because I'm not just an isolated actor. And so as I started to think about the triad of faith, work, and economics, that as a holistic model of what vocation is all about made sense to me. But then I started to look at, well, what really is the relationship between our faith and our work? Well, our work is an outward expression of whatever we believe to be true about our relationship with God. And therefore, work is necessarily connected in some way to what I would call morality, which is how a person lives out their internalized sense of right and wrong. And then I started to look at the relationship between my individual work and how that work is joined or connected to the work of others to form an economic system. And how is it that we do that? Well, we do that in some form with agreements about the rules. What are the rules of engagement? What are the rules of working together? What are the rules of competition? What are the rules of fair play and unfair play? And those are all questions for me of governance. How do we govern our life together? And out of that working together through that governance system to create an economy, then the question becomes, is that economy accountable to anything other than itself? And for me, in a Christian ethic of those who would be the master of all must be the servant of all. In some way, an economy to fit into this model must have in mind who is this economy serving, and how is this economy serving? And then that becomes a question for me of social responsibility or social ethics. And so in that way, the model ties together. I think it's worth mentioning that when you have set up your series, you've set it up with the triad of faith, vocation, and economics. For me, work is a little bit different. It's closely related, but it's a little different from vocation in the sense that I've done lots of work in my life that I would not consider my vocation. Right. So when I was in college, I worked summers at the Federal Reserve Bank as a security guard. Being a security guard was my work, but my vocation was being a college student. Right. So those two things are related, but they're not precisely the same. I went through a bad patch. One time in my life when I was actually unemployed, happily, it was for a relatively short time. But when I was in my 20s, I would find myself unemployed and I was just looking for work anywhere. And I got a job on the 4 to midnight shift at a Pepsi-Cola rebottling company, washing returned Coke bottle or Pepsi bottles so that they could be refilled with Pepsi. Was my work, but it sure as heck wasn't my vocation. Ever, right? So I think that vocation for me it encompasses more than just my work. And that's why the integrated model for me made sense.
But I'm going to open this up for questions in just a second, but this model seems to be so helpful, Wayne. Could you use that to help us in some of the developments in Washington over the last week? I mean, when we watch, most of us are a little disappointed. Always point to integrity, with some exception. Or maybe there's a business examples you can give, so we can see you apply your model to real life situations that we're aware of.
Sure.
How are you using your model to think when you're watching the news or when you're reading about business?
Sure. So if, for example, we take as an article, now this is from a Lutheran point of view, obviously, we say that one of the ways that faith illuminates our lives is that we understand that the Word of God comes to us as both law and gospel. And in law and gospel, in that paradigm, there is a sense of accountability to God through accountability to God's rules, God's law. Right. And at the same time, in that law and gospel paradigm, there is the realization that even though we do not perfectly fulfill the law, we are set free by the gospel to act in the world in creative ways. So now you apply that to the political situation. Where is the accountability and where is the freedom? When you look at the people that were making decisions related to everything that happened. I mean, the impeachment trial, certainly, but also January 6th. To what degree were those people, who were they accountable to? What were they accountable to? And were they acting purely out of their own internal sense of right and wrong? Or was there a sense of that being integrated? When I look at the senators, the question I ask is, to whom are you accountable? Or to what are you accountable? In your decision, whatever that decision is, are you holding yourself accountable to your understanding of your faith? Are you holding yourself accountable to your constituency and whatever it is that they think? Are you only looking out for yourself and saying, if I act this way, I'm going to have a brighter political future than if I act that way? Because if we don't have that sense to some degree of external accountability, then the only thing we're accountable to is our own ego. And I think that's fundamentally pathological from a Christian point of view, when the only accountability is to our own ego needs. So on the other hand, we have to be responsible to our own internal sense of right and wrong. So what's the dialogue that goes on between that? Another example quickly that I mentioned in our conversation earlier, Rick, I happened to read an article. This was very interesting to me, that the Congressional Budget Office predicts that if the minimum wage of $15 an hour is implemented, that there will be people lifted out of poverty and there will be people that have a better life, but there will be 1.4 million jobs lost by 2025. Now, I'm not an economist, so I'm not disputing one way or the other whether that's true. For me as an ethicist, what's interesting in that statistic is, why is it true? Why is it true that those 1.4 million jobs are going to be lost? It might be that the businesses are operating on very thin margins, and if they don't cut their workforce, then they're destroying the work environment, the economic community for all their employees. In which case, they're being accountable to the community of their employees, even though it comes at a cost of individual employees. On the other hand, if they're feeling more accountable to turning a profit for their shareholders, they might be willing to throw their employees under the bus in order to keep the profit high for their shareholders. Or if they have a certain expectation of how they think they should be able to live as individuals, then they're being accountable to themselves and their own needs, or maybe to their family, but they're not necessarily being accountable anymore to the community of workers. So the model allows us, I think, to examine that. What are the rules of the game we're playing here? Rather than just uncritically accepting it as it's a bad thing because 1.4 million jobs are going to be lost, which is a bad thing. But then to look a little deeper as to what's operating in me inside, what's operating with me in the world outside. And I think this model helps to integrate that.
Great. I hope that your answers and your model has stimulated the group here so that we can open it up for questions and dialogue. Okay, I'll jump in then. If you can unmute. Wayne, one of the things that you said in your taped interview was that you worried about us experiencing a fragmented life.
Yes. And
the way you described it, it was that indeed there was a gap between our lives on Sunday and Monday. you even suggested that maybe we're different people at church, different people at work, different people at home, maybe different people at the club. And then you call that as the danger, this fragmented life. I wanted to know from the group, but also from you, how you that fragmentation and why you're interested in the integration.
So I think that, I guess I would say this, I don't think we are different people. Actually, I think that's the point. We're one person. However, because of the fact that we don't ever operate in isolation, we're not ever just individuals. We're always in social systems. Then what's working on us all the time in the environment that they're in is the ethics, whether implied or spelled out, the ethics of the communal situation in which we're in. And that ethical system is putting pressure on it that may or may not be consistent with the ethics of another community that we find ourselves in. And now, if you have a strong, what I would call a strong community of identification, then what's happened is that you have internalized the ethics of that reference community more deeply than the ethics of other communities that you operate in. But you still have to negotiate on a day-to-day basis which one of those ethics is the ethic that you're going to operate out of at that particular moment. And what I would suggest is that when that tension, living in a pluralistic environment where we operate in multiple ethical systems, either, if not simultaneously, at least in a rapid serial form, where we move from this to this to this to this, and there's different rules, what happens is that you're constantly making decisions about which ethic you're going to live within in order to be part of that community, that economic community. I would call it an economy in order to be a participant in that economy. When the contradiction or the conflict between those ethical value systems becomes very intense, in my observation, and now more as a pastoral counselor than anything else, that creates varying levels of anxiety and acting out behavior.
Could you give examples of that? And you mentioned early on that you had experienced that when you were in the business world as well.
Sure.
It wasn't, a huge issue, but there were some things that you were negotiating.
Right. So I'll give you a couple examples. The first is kind of mundane, but it is an example. And that is when I was working for the National Can Corporation, a sort of an edict came down from on high. At that time, they were debating whether or not to have return deposit mechanisms on aluminum cans. Because the states that were doing this were saying, well, people are throwing their aluminum cans all over the place instead of returning them. And so they wanted to put a deposit on aluminum cans so that people would recycle or return or whatever their aluminum cans. Well, clearly, this is not to the advantage of National Can Corporation economically, right? Because they're taking away one of the primary advantages of using cans. Almost everybody prefers to drink beer or pop out of a bottle. But they buy cans because they chill easily and because they're convenient and because you don't have to worry about dragging them back and forth and setting up the refilling plant that I worked at when I was with Mexico. Right? So they said, you write to your legislators and advocate for not passing this deposit law. Well, from a National Can point of view, and I was a good employee and I wanted to do what was in best interest of National Can because I was dependent upon them as my employer. But my internal ethics said, maybe it's not such a good thing that people are throwing their cans all over the forest preserve. Maybe this really would help with the environment if there were laws. So then I had to work through a decision about which ethical system was the system that was going to dictate how I behaved in that particular situation. So, yes, there's a question there. So,
no, I just wanted to comment on the notion of self, and that is what you believe to be true about yourself, the concept. And when we behave in ways that yield a disintegration of that self-concept, the striving to maintain homeostasis, which we all do in every area of our life, if you cannot maintain homeostasis, then the disruption of concept itself is really intense, and the struggle is wild. So that balance is a big issue for me. In behaviors or governance, how do we make?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and people deal with that in different ways, that tension in different ways. So, for example, some people are able to compartmentalize.
That's right.
Right. So here's who I am when I'm here, and here's who I am who I'm there. Until you get into a situation where you look at yourself in the mirror and say, "Who the heck am I?" Right. And then that coping mechanism of compartmentalization starts to break down. Right. So what is it that precipitates crisis? What precipitates crisis is, at least in my understanding of crisis, is three things. One is a breakdown of your standard coping mechanisms. One is that you suddenly have a distorted perception of reality. You're not looking at things the way they really are. And the third is a breakdown in your social systems. So the standard intervention in crisis intervention is help people find new coping mechanism, help them restore their social context, and then begin to reframe what's going on in their lives so that they're more in touch with reality. Those are the things. Well, if you compartmentalize, and if that compartmentalization causes social isolation from one group that's important to you, you are precipitating, quite literally, clinically, you're precipitating a crisis in your life, right? And that's why I say that the disintegrated, when I'm using the word disintegrate or fragment, that is really a crisis that I think that we're seeing acted out in lots of ways. Now, I can't give you clinical evidence for this. There are others that might be able to do it. But I would say, for example, that the huge problem of addictive behavior is a way of somehow trying to get rid of the anxiety of living in that fragmented environment. And no matter how much you gain in terms of economic prosperity, gaining something more from outside that you take in to try to fill up the hole in your soul. That hole in your soul is a black hole. No matter how much you throw into it, it's still going to want more, right? And that's an addictive cycle. And we see this all over the place. So now I'm just fascinated by the rise of sportsbook apps. And I'm looking at this and you can parlay this. I'm not in the world of gambling. So some of you may be. Gambling has just never been very attractive for me. I'm too low risk of a personality, I think, for it. But this is just one manifestation of how this acting out starts to happen. For some people, the acting out happens sexually. You become a sexual compulsive. For some people, it comes out with substance abuse. For some people, it just comes out with over-the-top anxiety. For some people, it comes out with as what's sometimes called workaholism, where all you do is work, 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 work. So I think that those things are reflective of something that's you're working at trying to resolve this anxiety that's in you. That's my view of it.
Thanks. Great question.
So I was just going to, if I can just finish one other example. When I became bishop, I automatically became a member of the healthcare corporation, of a faith-based healthcare corporation in our area, which was, by the way, was a very good experience. It was very positive in general. But this is another place where values rub up against one another, right? So if it's in the best interest of the hospital corporation to close a hospital that's sitting in the middle of an underserved neighborhood, what the heck do I do in the board meetings? How do I deal with that? Because the healthcare board, I actually did a presentation on ethics in healthcare and talked about the way that you have multiple things. So you have certain legal obligations that are upon you all the time that you have to honor. And there are certain financial obligations that you have, both to the corporation and if there are shareholders, to the shareholders. And then if you're a faith-based corporation, you have certain ethical values that you're accountable to that give you your identity as a faith-based organization. And all of those ethical systems are operating in every board meeting all the time. And you negotiate it, frankly, through your relationships with the other people on the board, as well as your relationships with the other constituencies that you're accountable to on the outside. Plus, you've got accountability to the fiduciary responsibility to confidentiality. So I would come out of those board meetings and they'd make a decision to close a hospital, and I'd go back and I'd face the pastors and the congregations in the communities that are now going to lose their hospital. They don't know how I voted in the board meeting, and I can't tell them. They don't know what went into the conversation, what didn't go into the conversation, and I can't tell them. So how in the world do I maintain my accountability to those pastors and those communities around that fiduciary responsibility as a corporate board member? It's very complicated and difficult.
Hi, Wayne.
Right.
Hi, Wayne. I'm Teresa Shaw. How are you this morning?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
We're talking about the accountability, and when I used to work in nonprofits, I felt like I had two accountabilities. One was from my passion and love for helping the community, so I had that accountability. The other accountability was to the board of directors or governors of. So I always felt like I was switching back and forth. I don't know whether that was seen as compartmentalizing, but that's how I felt. It wasn't until I left the nonprofit sector that I began to look at, well, who am I? Because I had this switching that I was doing back and forth. And so it still has been challenging for me to decide, well, I guess less challenging now, because I feel like I am who I
Right.
want to be, as opposed to the accountability to others.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I'll just say this first of all, both exist. Because to some degree, our internalized sense of who we are, our internalized sense of morality, we've internalized those values from somewhere, right? So what I was talking before about reference community, this was really striking for me. When I was in the Conference of Bishops, I was having a conversation with, I'll just name this because Bishop Cal Holloway, who at the time was from Southern Ohio. He was Bishop of Southern Ohio Synod. African-American bishop. And there were and are not a lot of African-American bishops in the ELCA, right? Cal was a good friend. We'd known each other for years. And he came in late for a bishop's meeting one time because he had been meeting with the African-American strategy team. And I talked to him about it. And I said, he said, I just needed some time with my reference community.
Mm-hmm.
So he was just saying right out, there are two communities here and their ethical values, and these are both in the church, right? These are high-level communities within the structure of the church community. And he's saying, I needed to refresh my awareness of who I was so that I could bring that into the context of this other community. And that was his way of kind of trying to work with just exactly what I think you're describing. I think this is also why we often have the feeling when we come out of a community where we're in tension, we come out of it and we have this feeling of what I would describe as a feeling of coming back to ourselves. I'm coming back to myself, right? And it's literally what you're doing. You're coming back to yourself, and
Well, I feel like I'm coming back to one side of myself,
right.
and that one side of myself was community.
Right.
Okay, it was always community. So now I don't feel governed by, I still have accountability to as far as my work, but I don't feel it's a difference. It feels that it's a difference.
So I think that one of the things that can be useful in this, and one of the things that I have found useful, is to develop what I would call a system of subsidiarity. That I know that I'm accountable in multiple ethical systems, but I have a sense that some accountabilities are higher than other accountabilities for me to keep myself intact, for me to keep my own person intact. And with that in mind, I can say, well, when I'm at this board meeting, I'm a board member, and I have to be thinking about the interests of this corporation, right? But I know that ultimately that accountability is in a subsidiary relationship to my accountability to my faith values. And I'll tell people that. I mean, I'm not going to mince words about that. So when that healthcare board, for example, they would bring issues related to, in my opinion, how they were going to be union busting. Now, they wouldn't call it union busting. They would call it looking out for the welfare of the corporation. But I just said to the whole board, I didn't make any issues about it. I said, you need to know that I am deeply conflicted about this. And I am not going to be a spokesperson for this corporation on this particular issue. I will listen, and I'm one vote, and I'm not going to be able to stop you from doing what you do. But you need to deal with the fact that this contradicts my internal values, and you just have to live with it. So you can do it, right? You can do it and still be a responsible board member. But I do think that you also have to recognize, and that's why going through an exercise like we're doing right now, if in my mind, the primary value of it is that it slows down processes that most of us do without thinking about it. We never bring it to conscious awareness. And as a result of that, we stumble into these situations where we feel disintegrated, but we only feel it as sort of a vague general sense of discomfort or anxiety, or maybe I need a change or whatever. And I think that this, an exercise like this allows us to kind of step back and say, well, what is my primary reference community? What are the values that I'm operating out of? And then we have to make decisions, sometimes decisions that bring us pain in order to do that. This actually is the meaning of a theology of the cross. A theology of the cross is not the same. For me, moral suffering is not the same as existential pain, right? Existential pain is the pain that just comes to us in life, the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to quote Shakespeare, right? It happens to all of us. We get sick. We didn't do anything to get sick. It's not a moral decision to get sick. It just happened to us, right? But there are other things where we make decisions to endure pain in order to do what we believe is right. And I would say that that's the message of the cross. Jesus didn't commit suicide, for goodness sakes. He lived his life the way he thought it should be lived, and he paid a price for that. And so then the question that the theology of the cross always puts before us is, when is it time for me to say, I'm not going there? And if I pay the price, I pay the price. It's hard. It's really hard.
So when you were in the bishops' conference, or when you were on this board, working through some of these ethical issues, when you were even in Chicago, trying to live out your vocation in a very complex synod, a very complicated synod. What role did the local congregation play for you in helping you figure out some of the dilemmas, some of the issues that you're trying to work out?
Well, I think that for me,
Expectation.
For me, the important thing is to identify a community of trust where you can do a little bit of external processing on decisions when they come up and be who you are. And this, by the way, for me, this is a whole other subject, but this is the distinction between a community, or one of the distinctions between a community and an institution. We need both, right? But the purpose of an institution actually is to maximize the mission vision that we have in common and to minimize our individual idiosyncrasies so that we can all work together, regardless of those idiosyncrasies, on accomplishing a common mission. And institutions can accomplish a great deal. Communities, on the other hand, the mission is for everybody in the circle to be who they are and to share who they are with the other people in the circle. So honesty and trust are the primary values, right? And I think it was Emerson that used the image of sitting in a circle and everybody has a closet. And when you sit in your community, everybody opens their closet and they take something out and put it into the center of the circle. And then when the conversation is over, everybody reaches back into the center of the circle and puts something back into themselves. But it's not exactly what they put into the circle because it's now been mixed with what everybody else put in the circle. So I've been transformed to some degree simply by sitting in the circle and sharing in that community, right? But don't ask a community to accomplish a mission because their mission is to respect and value the individuality of everybody in the circle, right? So I need places of community where I'm not required to be in alignment. I'm simply required to be authentic. And everybody else has the same thing. And there's trust, and there is a circle of confidentiality around that in order to protect it, in order to protect that safety. And then that process helps to discern. And I think that this is why it is necessary for Christians to always live in community. It actually is not always necessary for Christians to live in institutional structures. We have simply found that beneficial. So as I've often said, I don't think I've said it in this group, what do you need? People, whenever we were doing a building program or we were advancing some big mission in the church where I was pastor, people would say, do we really need this? Do we really need to do this? And I would say, no. Here's what we need. To be an authentic Christian community, you need a bowl of water, a loaf of bread, a bottle of wine, a Bible, and 2 baptized Christians. If you have that, you are already the church. But what is God calling you to do? For that, you might need to build an institution. Right? So it's not about what's needed. It's about what's possible because we have been set free by the gospel of Jesus Christ. Right? So I don't think actually that there is such a thing as an individual Christian. I just don't think it's possible to be an individual. I mean, the promise is wherever 2 or more are gathered in my name, there I will be. Right? So in some way, community is necessary. And part of it is because we need this dialogue between this, what I would now call this community of accountability, and my internal accountability to myself as an individual, because both of those things are really necessary. And by the way, this is also when I was talking about the law gospel thing, when the law of God has been internalized, it is the gospel. Because when the law of God is internalized to now it's integrated into who I am as a human being, then expressions of the law are expressions of my freedom. That's what feels most free to me. That's why, for example, when you talk to Jews and they talk about the Torah, which we generally translate as the law, that they don't mean constraint. Jews see Torah as a gift from God in order to make a good life possible. Without the Torah, life is chaos. Right? So that, and in Jeremiah 31, and it's not an accident that Jeremiah 31:31 is read every year in Lutheran churches on Reformation Day. It says, "No longer will I teach them my statutes because they'll be written on their hearts."
So Wayne, what if you're a businesswoman and what you've learned about business as far as governance and the rules is dog. In other words, you can't play by the rules and win, and that's the rule, right?
Yes.
You got to sometimes break legal norms, and that's just the way the economy functions. So that would be internalizing a very different set of rules. Right?
Yes.
The rules that I would live in my family, right? By which that would not work in my family, would not work in my church, but maybe I've been taught it's that those hard-nosed practices is how you get to the top of the mountain.
Yes, and you again along the way it may not go smoothly, but what I'm saying is that I think in the long run, for just an example as bishop, I have served under bishops who had insiders. They had an inside group of pastors that were the people that they would tap for an extra benevolence contribution or an extra whatever. And it was never defined. Nobody knew who the bishop's inside group were, but you all kind of knew that it was there. When I walked into the bishop's office, first of all, it was a different time. And part of it was who I was coming into the bishop's office. For me, fairness is a very, very high moral priority. And fairness requires transparency. Well, the fact of the matter is, I might have been able to get more money if I'd had a handful of insiders that I knew had access to money that I could tap on the shoulder and say, hey, let's go for a golf game. And while we're out on the golf course, we'll work a deal. And you can give an extra $10,000 of benevolence. But it would have taken about a New York minute, particularly for underserved communities or communities of color in our synod to figure out that there was a shim under one leg of the pool table and nothing was quite rolling the way it was supposed to. That then becomes, frankly, this is another kind of a tangent maybe in some ways, but that is what systemic racism is all about. Is that there are rules that are not spoken. Well, so I made the decision that fairness was a fundamental ethical value for me as a person of faith, and I lived that way. And I believe it made me both a better bishop and a more successful bishop in the long run. But I made that decision, and there's a certain amount of risk that's involved in making those decisions. What I would say is that at the end result, I want to be very careful here. One of the reasons that I got interested in this whole faith work and economics thing is that I do not believe that economic success is the enemy of morality and ethics. And one of the things that frustrates the bejeebers out of me as a person who worked and operated in the business community is that I look at the Lutheran system, and I've got the ELCA has 26 colleges and universities. I'm on the board of directors of one of them. What is the purpose of those institutions? The purpose of those institutions is to educate our emerging young adults to go into the world and be successful. So we give recognition for merits and being summa cum laude and being an outstanding and having success and being competitive, et cetera, et cetera. And then we send them out into the world where they get to go to church every Sunday for the next 40 years and get beat up about how evil they are because they've achieved the success that we trained them to achieve in college. What sense does this make? Right? We got to do better than that. But I also think that we can challenge people to think about ethical questions. So the guy that runs, I'm going to forget the name of the company that does these outdoor clothing and equipment. So Cuinard, I think is the name, or Chouinard is the name of the guy who runs it. And he did research in his company about the way cotton is raised and the way standard farming practices for raising cotton essentially rape the earth. So he set out figuring out sustainable ways of creating high quality clothing and using different kinds of synthetic fibers that are, in his way of working this out, are ethically produced. Now, Chouinard will say, and I've read interviews with him, he will say, we never completely get away from the fact that economic activity is hard on the environment. You can never completely escape that. But you can make choices about what is going to move you closer. And now he has invested millions and millions of dollars as an ethical act, as a moral act in environmental education for public schools, for corporations, because this is his way of kind of trying to deal with that ethical tension that he feels in a conscious way.
All right, I want to let those who have not had a chance yet to get your oar in the water, this would be the time to do that. Anyone want to jump in here?
I have a question. I'm just going to ramble and see how Bishop responds. As soon as you started talking about a bishop, I drew the triangle and I put everything in where it was supposed to be. It just comes back to me. And this relationship between faith and economics is the social ethic, as you were saying, right? The accountability. From my experience, there's just a struggle in terms of the way we do church on how we just internalize that ethic. And I feel like now that we've experienced this shift in the way we do church, now is the time, in a sense, to turn it inside out and to use those tools that have been given to us through technology to proclaim this social ethic more externally. And I just want to know your thoughts about that, and maybe how these little communities, as you say, that are I really like that idea of this layered community and then the institution over that, because now I am seeing the communities more in the middle of the triangle, right, and the institutions are the faith and the work and the economics. So the communities are more about the morality and the governance and the ethic. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's just how I'm seeing it. And so how do we not keep that? How do we get that out from under the bushel basket, so to speak? We're doing it with our partnerships with other nonprofits. But how if I partner with a nonprofit and they're doing something that I don't agree with, or that we don't agree with as a community, I would think it would be our place to point that out.
Yes.
It's not really a question, but I just wanted you to opine about it.
No, it's great thinking, and I think that it is certainly true that we're going to be in situations. The world is ambiguous. When none of us are going to be in an environment that's so what I would call ethically homogeneous, that we're never going to experience any conflicts. The question is, what do you do with it? So one of the things that might be useful at this point, I think I can describe this without a visual, although it works well with a visual. If you visualize a line down the middle of the page, and that line represents the wall between inside faith community and outside the faith community. There are doorways that open in that wall, and people move back and forth between them. So ostensibly, people have some sort of a conversion experience, if you want to call it conversion, whether it's through baptism, or it doesn't have to be a dramatic, personal, religious thing. It can be just a routine. I'm baptized, and that invites me from the outside in.
We've been calling it the realization.
Yeah, right. So that happens through some process of invitation, right? And then once you're inside the community, invitation leads to formation. And we're formed simply in life in the community. And a lot of those formation things, a lot of those rules, which have to do with governance, a lot of those rules actually are unspoken. It's just sort of, this is the way children behave. This is the way we act in church. This is the way we don't talk out loud and go out for popcorn during the sermon. Well, why not? We do that at the baseball game. Why don't we do it if the sermon gets boring, go out and get some popcorn? Why not? Because we have these rules and we're formed by these rules. But then that formation sends us back out into the world through action. And when we go back out into the world to act on the faith that's been formed on it, we're moving back through the other doorway out into the world. And what we experience in that world that's outside of the church is transformation. But who's transformed? Everyone is transformed. I'm transformed by the work that I do on the outside at the same way that I'm transforming the world on the outside by what I bring to it. And now that transformation that happens out there in the world is brought into me, and I come back in the church, but I don't come back in the same as I was when I went out, right? So now I come back into the church with the power of reformation. And that reformation that I bring into it as part of the church community also changes the church. And I am more deeply reformed as a result of my re-entry. And then I'm sent back out into the world with action, being a slightly different person than I was the last time. It isn't a cycle, it's a cyclone. I call it the evangelical whirlwind, because the deeper you go into the world, the more you need partnerships, institutional partnerships to accomplish what you want to do. And the more deeply you come back into the faith, the more you need in what I would call institutionalized teaching mechanisms, where now I may need seminary professors to take this to the next deeper level. And when I go back out into the world for action, I may need a social ministry institution in order to help me do what I'm called to do, and et cetera, et cetera. And it just keeps getting wider and wider, the more it becomes a lifestyle to be formed in that way, and to engage dynamically in your relationships with the world. You're never done. And you're also never done. You're never done dying every day to sin and rising with Christ. You're never done. I did a sermon for a few years ago for the story of Lazarus, in John 11. And I started the sermon by bringing out, I planned my own funeral. And I read the plan for the funeral, and I said, and I put it away, but then I got to thinking about all the stuff that wasn't in my plan. So I planned another funeral, and it was every bit as good as the first one. So now I'm afraid, for those of you who are still around, you're not going to just have to go to one funeral for me. You're going to have to go to two, and you don't get lunch until after the second one, because sometimes one funeral is not enough. And then I talked about the fact that Lazarus had to die twice. Why is this a gift? wasn't bad enough. He had to die once. He had to die again. And from that, you come to the realization that death for Christians is not an event. Death is a lifestyle.
True. I think that's a real crescendo when we believe this, with moving from the whirlwind to death as a lifestyle. Wayne, one of the things that I've always been impressed of with you is just your deep, rich thinking about scripture, about our tradition, our Lutheran tradition, and about engaging the world. You bring your own experience on multiple levels, from business to congregational life, to the bishop's office, and now as a husband and father, working your vocational life at home. So that really is expressed so wonderfully in all your comments, and I would even say your us as we issues through your model, helping us slow down, right? Maybe think through some of the dynamics. I just want to thank for your willingness to share your insights over and over again here at Emmanuel. It's always great to see your smiling face, but also to hear your intelligence, your intellectual depth, really helping us. So I really appreciate that. So on behalf of Emmanuel once again and our program Mondays at Emmanuel, I want to encourage you to write some of this stuff down, Wayne. I think it's really brilliant, and I hope you put it together in some sort of form that we can hold on to it and think about it more richly in the future.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for making the time this morning. It's great to be with you, and thanks for the questions.
Sure.
Great. Thanks for joining us on Monday to Manual. Next week, Chris Armstrong, the Family Foundation, and he was the major editor of the magazine that we're giving away. Again, if you'd like one, just let us know and we'll send it to you. So thanks again for joining us for Monday to Manual. Bye-bye now.
Bye.